the chat is
Okay.
enabled. We're recording. And now everyone's joining, so we'll be starting momentarily. I think we're up to, we can all see how many people. We're up to 19, so let me keep admitting people. Just a few housekeeping things. Oscar, is it okay if we record this, even though I started it?
Yes, no problem.
Okay, I mean, I can stop it if we want to.
No, don't worry about it.
Susan pointed out that in Illinois, it's not legal unless we get your permission. So just want to be sure.
I'm good.
Okay, and closed captioning is enabled, so you can have it, click on it, enable yourself to watch it. And any questions you have, put them in the chat box. Susan and Oscar are going to give us an overview and talk about some of the topics that are really current that we all want to know about. And then we'll open things to questions. And depending on the size, sometimes people just raise their hands, but we'll go on with that. Let me tell you about Susan and Oscar. Susan is a senior instructional professor in the college at the University of Chicago, appointed in 2001 after 2 decades practicing law and teaching as a part-time lecturer at the University of Chicago Law School. Her research interests include the interrelationship between human rights and migration policy, the domestic application of international human rights norms, and Mexico-US relations. Susan also teaches courses on contemporary issues in human rights, the human rights of aliens and citizens, human rights in Mexico, and the use of international human rights norms in the United States. And her mother was a member of NCJW. But that's another story, another good story. Oscar is executive director of Alianza Americas. It's a network of migrant-led organizations working in the United States and transnationally to create an inclusive, equitable, and sustainable way of life for communities across North America, North, Central, and South America. And whoever is unmuted, please mute.
Beth, you can put them on mute yourself.
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna.
You should.
Yeah, okay. Before stepping into his current role in 2007, Oscar served in leadership positions at the Chicago-based Heartland Alliance for Human Needs and Human Rights, the Northern California Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, the Boston-based Centro Presente, and several other community-based and international development organizations. So we are well represented, and we have experts, so we're thrilled. And I'm going to turn this over to Susan. Except I have to figure out how.
First, I better unmute myself.
Yeah. Okay.
Good evening. It's an honor to be here with National Council of Jewish Women. And as Beth said, my mother was a member of the council, and I made my first appearance at a political rally when she was part of a National Council of Jewish Women lobbying group, showing up at President Truman's 1952 Presidential Commission on Immigration. Truman was upset that the Congress in 1952 had not revoked the horrible National Origins Act that had been put into the law in the 1920s, and the council and other Jewish and Catholic mostly organizations were lobbying to get those quotas overturned. So I'll talk about that a little bit, but that was my first appearance at a political action having to do with immigration. I was in the stroller. I didn't say much. I was probably less than a year old. So, but I'm glad to be back here many years later. I'm going to use a PowerPoint, and I might go through it very quickly because I have 20 minutes to talk. I was just going to set my own timer here. But the PowerPoint itself will be available. You can just get a copy of it from Beth after the program because it's too much to write. You know, I just want to give you a sort of historic framework and timeline of what we're talking about. but it's nice for you to have a set of references. And I'm very much a believer in open source. So if any of you go on to do your own talks on immigration policy and you want to copy out pages of this PowerPoint, that's absolutely fine with me. So let me share the screen and get the PowerPoint. And here we go. Let me just, so can you guys, you all can see the PowerPoint? Okay, fine. All right. Oh, great. Now I can't get it to change. All right. Let me go back. I may not use the PowerPoint if I can't make it move. Stop sharing. I'm sorry about this. I should have practiced this beforehand. No, I've done this before many times with my students, and I don't know why it's not responding to me. Oh, there it goes. Okay. Basically, one of the questions that I was asked to talk about is who can become the United States. And I want to go through this in a very quick way, looking at sort of the phases of our history in which there were different regimes of who could get to be a permanent resident and how those were handled. I'm going to do a whole bunch of history extremely quickly. In the first period of the United States as both a set of British colonies and later an independent republic, I would call that an age of expansion in which the colonies and then later the federal government were engaged in first importing slaves into the US, enslaved persons from Africa as part of their labor force, and getting involved in the expansion of territory, which included killing and driving out the indigenous population. We have the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, which adds a huge amount of territory in the middle of the country. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo at the end of the war against Mexico, where we get 40% of Mexico's territory. And the response is that both the Congress and legislatures in the US in this first part of the 19th century set about recruiting settlers from Northern Europe. But they were also recruiting in China. But in China, it was clear that they were recruiting people, and this is the theme that we're going to have going on through this presentation. They were recruiting people just as temporary workers. They were not allowing Chinese workers to bring their families with them. And so this starts this kind of two-track system that we see today, which is some people are welcome for their work, but we don't see them as future citizens and part of the country. Meaning the people establishing the laws. I do, but anyway, that's sort of figuratively. And the other thing that was happening in this period in the early 19th century that we think of as a period of huge expansion in immigration is that while we're allowing and bringing in white settlers within the states, there's a restriction on the residence and travel within the United States of free blacks. And I would go into some detail on that, but this isn't the time that we're going to go into that. So then after we get this huge era of expansion, we get into the 1870s and 1880s, where we start to have what I call an age of restriction and the growth of the eugenics movement, also known as white supremacy. And we get a whole series of enactments. Now, one of the things that's lucky that happens before we get into this period, at the end of the Civil War, in the enactment of the 14th Amendment, the United States declares birthright citizenship for anyone born in the United States. And that, as a constitutional provision, has held up through some of the worst anti-immigrant periods in US history. There was litigation in the late 19th century contesting whether the children of Chinese who were themselves being excluded from the United States, barred from naturalizing, could, by virtue of being born in the United States, be considered US citizens. And the Supreme Court's consistent answer was yes. So the 14th Amendment, back to 1868, I think is the passage of the 14th Amendment, really sets a floor for who can be a natural born citizen of the United States. Later, there are racial restrictions on naturalization, which really don't come off the books until 1965, but we'll get to that in a bit. So really the 1880s till 1965 constitute an age of restriction where we have attacks and expulsions of the Chinese, but we have the large-scale recruitment of Mexicans, because one of the factors, there are several factors that govern, in general, US immigration policy. One of them is labor market needs, clearly, that the doors tend to be a bit more open at a time of acute labor needs in the United States. Another is foreign policy. The US will change and has changed its immigration policy towards certain groups of immigrants based on the foreign policy implications of those policies. We're sometimes sensitive to the interests of foreign powers. During the period of attacks and expulsion of the Chinese, Theodore Roosevelt and the presidents just before him were eager to have good foreign relations with Japan, so the Japanese in the United States had a somewhat preferential treatment over the way the Chinese were treated until you get to 1907, where Congress passes laws that allow for the complete exclusion of Asians and begins to enact qualitative restrictions on who can be a resident of the US. Do you have a criminal background? Are you a prostitute? Or are you likely to become a public charge? In other words, someone who has to live based on state-provided assistance. But this whole early eugenics period, starting with the exclusion of Asians and the Chinese and these qualitative restrictions, comes to a head in 1922 and 1924, when the Congress passes successive laws that establish for the first time country quotas, that only a certain number of immigrants will be allowed in from particular countries. No immigrants are allowed in from many countries. And some countries in Europe have much smaller quotas than other countries in Europe, because the intent of these laws in the 1920s is to roll back the demographics of the country so that it looks more like the population at the time of the 1880 census, which was the beginning of the period of the massive arrival of Jews and Catholics from Southern Europe. So these laws in the 1920s are explicitly enacted by Congress in order to, I guess, make America white again in the terms that they understood racial categories at those times. So these laws being on the books then lead to a number of implications in the following decades. One is that there are bars to Jewish refugees all during the period of Hitler's rise, all during the Holocaust, because most of the Jewish refugees are coming out of countries that have very small quotas. And Congress resisted lifting quotas or changing any of the country quotas merely to admit refugees. Now, the Mexicans who have been recruited into the United States starting in the 1880s are on a slightly different track during this period. Not only are we encouraging recruitment, and settlement of families is happening kind of somewhat under the radar, but in 1917, when Congress passed a literacy restriction as one of the qualitative restrictions in the run-up to the 1920s legislation, the Secretary of Agriculture asked and was allowed to exempt Mexicans who were needed to be working in California agriculture to be exempt from the literacy restriction. And it's interesting to note that not until the 1930s do we begin to see mass deportations of Mexicans, who become a handy scapegoat for the economic problems of the Depression, and also are just sort of, and in the deportation of Mexicans during that period, something like between 40 and 50% of the Mexican population in the US was deported or voluntarily left to Mexico. And among those Mexicans were US citizens who were born to Mexican immigrants in the US during that period. So the US changes its policy towards Mexicans at the beginning of World War II, I forgot to put that in my timeline, which is that in 1942, the US concludes a treaty with Mexico right after our entry into the war to bring large numbers of Mexican guest workers into the US under certain conditions. And for example, the Mexican government argues that they shouldn't be sent to Texas because Texas was so notorious for its Jim Crow, post-Civil War, anti-Black and brown people. They were able, the first 3 years of the program, to not have Mexicans sent to Texas. But after 1945, it became a unilaterally administered program, and it was no longer a bilateral agreement with the Mexican government. The US didn't feel the need to do that once the war was over. But Mexican workers kept coming into the US at fairly high levels on a basis through 1965. The other things that happened during this period are we get the crack in the bar to certain nationalities created in the early 20th century and in the 1920s begins to lift a bit after World War II. And it's partly the reaction to the horrific genocide in Europe, to the fascist practices of Japanese and their persecutions of various national groups in the Pacific. And we have at first 1948, the Displaced Persons Act, allowing some refugees to come in from Europe, and the War Brides Act, which is one of the first laws that allows Asians to settle in the United States. In 1952, as I said, there's this big push to get rid of the 1920s quotas, but it fails. But it's I think, the strength of the civil rights movement and the 1965 Civil Rights Act that also creates the mood in Congress, and if public opinion is part of why certain immigration laws may pass at certain times. I think that the drive headed by the civil rights movement to get rid of racially restrictive laws in general sets the stage, as did the 1960 election, John F. Kennedy as the first Catholic president of the United States. Kennedy wrote, or had ghostwritten for him, a popular book at the time called The Nation of Immigrants. So between the Civil Rights Act and the election and civil rights movement and the election of the first Catholic president, we get the end of the national origins quotas in the 1965 Immigration Act, which is signed by LBJ, which opens immigration from Asia, Africa, Southern and Eastern Europe, and has a small quota for persons fleeing communism. It sets quotas which are based on relationships to people who are already permanent residents or citizens of the US and certain employment categories. There's a maximum annual country quota of 20,000 for Eastern Hemisphere countries, up to 20,000. And the Western Hemisphere is given a quota of 100,000 for the whole hemisphere. Now, this is really bad news for Mexico. It's pretty good news for everybody else around the world, that at least there are possibilities, although the creating of equal quotas for every country in the world means that China has the same annual cap as Switzerland does. And so the countries where the US had traditional streams of immigration, had cultivated immigration from those countries, China, India, the Philippines, and Mexico, begin to develop waiting lists that in many cases turn out to be years long because of this principle of fairness that all countries should be treated equal. In 1976, there's a further refinement of the 1965 Act, which under the guise of fairness, then puts this 20,000 per country cap on every country in the Western Hemisphere, ends the possibility of getting a green card through a child born in the US until that child becomes 21 years old, but overnight changes what has been mostly a legal stream of migration from Mexico, as Mexico is taking 80% of that 100,000 over the 65 to 76 period. And in 76, by suddenly putting a country cap of 20,000, it turns a stream of migration which previously was largely legal to being largely illegal. So then we get to what I call the age of restriction 2.0. And the age of restriction 2.0 is really the 1980s to the present. We have the wars in Central America intensifying in the 1980s. Mexico has an economic crisis in the 1980s after its 1970s oil boom. So migration is growing not only from those countries, but from other regions of the world as well. The oil boom affects the Middle East, it affects Nigeria. People from some of those regions who had been able to be studying in the United States suddenly find their source of support from their home countries cut off as we have the oil crash in 1982, creating undocumented populations within those communities also. Under the Refugee Act of 1980, it's a generous act which sets an international standard, but the Reagan administration opposes it, does everything they can administratively to block asylum applications from people fleeing governments that they support. But civil society in the US rebels, the sanctuary movement, the courts, manages to modify, and finally by a legislative act much later, allows several 100,000 people who were denied asylum during the Reagan years to be able to finally become permanent residents of the United States, several 100,000 Salvadorans and Guatemalans. In 1986, it becomes clear that the country quota idea, that all these countries were going to have equal access to US residents, but there are these huge waiting lists and conditions in Mexico and Central America, social conditions are getting harsher, that we have a major amnesty bill passed by the US Congress under the Reagan administration, which legalizes over 2 million undocumented people. We also have the creation in the 1980s of temporary protected status. Now, I'm saying this as part of an age of restriction. These are expansive laws, but they're not expanded enough to meet the labor market needs, because we have the undocumented community keeps growing. And undocumented people would not be here if there weren't a labor market for them to be able to support their families. So it's a restrictive era, but you do have these kind of openings, but then they don't ever solve a problem. So we end up in 1996 with after immigrants have been demonized through the 70s and the 80s by a political drumbeat that's growing in the Republican Party, we have, surprisingly, under the Clinton administration, a Democratic administration that wants to appear very moderate, really the worst immigration law on the books since the 1920s, which makes it more difficult to become a permanent resident, which has much harsher penalties for people to be deported, even permanent residents who committed what previously would have been considered minor crimes. It sets up bars on people from ever becoming permanent residents who have been living in the country in undocumented status, unless they have certain relatives who they can plead hardship for. It sets up expedited removal, which provides for deportation without a hearing, which wasn't implemented until the Bush administration, but now it's being used quite a bit. And it fortifies the border, forcing migrants into more dangerous crossings, resulting in increasing deaths at the border. Now, I see I have 2.5 minutes left. I'm not going to bother to talk about what you all know from the Trump administration, the Muslim ban. They changed the rules for how much income you have to show to become a permanent resident. They generally slow down visa processing. They stop people coming in under overseas refugee programs and generate a tremendous amount of fear in immigrant communities. I'm going to skip through a couple of slides to get us to the Refugee Act of 1980, because I think that's the structure, the architecture of what we're dealing with today. Under our current law, now we're switching to who gets to be recognized as a refugee. We have a definition of a refugee taken out of international law, which is a pretty good non-sectarian, non-ideological definition. There are two paths to recognition as a refugee. You can either come in refugee resettlement as an overseas refugee, or apply for political asylum from within the United States or at the border. And both of these categories lead eventually to citizenship. Now, there are other what are called complementary protection options that allow a temporary status in the United States, which can be extended and extended. And Oscar's going to talk about that. I think TPS has been one of Alianza America's concerns. Or humanitarian parole, which allows people in the country to be admitted under, the president has that power under the law, or temporary protected status. But none of these complementary protection provisions, while they do provide safety, lead to a path to citizenship. And they either need to be renewed or surpassed by congressional legislation, which could give permanent residence to a particular national group. So where does the law allow for someone to apply for political asylum? I have 35 seconds, I'm almost done. You can't apply for political asylum from your home country. You can't apply at a US embassy. You can't really apply from abroad, except for certain new provisions specifically for Ukrainians and some Afghanis. You can apply at the border. You can apply in the interior of the United States. And supposedly you should be able to apply from any immigration status whatsoever. Now, I'm going to skip through the rest of these slides. You can see later. I think Oscar's going to take up some of these topics when he's talking about what the situation is for people as they come in, as they are trying to come into the United States. One of the things I want you to think about as a takeaway is, given all of these possible options, how have the US foreign policy interests, public perceptions, political calculations, and foreign policy interests affected how the US has dealt differently with Ukrainians, Afghans, Syrians, Salvadorans, Haitians, and how are we going to deal with climate change refugees? Have they been admitted as overseas refugees? Have they been admitted under humanitarian parole? Are we trying to block their entry? Are we allowing them to apply for political asylum? Have we given them temporary protected status? All right. That's as much as I think I need to say to introduce what Oscar's going to tell us about the contemporary situation. So take it away, Oscar.
Thank you, Susan. That normally takes weeks to understand. So you should definitely take the time to study Susan's PowerPoint presentation. Before I actually get to the substance of what's going on now, let me just emphasize some of the things that Susan said, or things I would add more as a matter of political context. First of all, I think it's important for everyone who wants to grasp properly why is it that we are so mean, with some people, particularly when they come to the US. It's because we were never really nice to newcomers. I mean, and that's something very important to understand. From the founding moments of the nation, people, meaning Anglo-Saxons, were very suspicious of anybody who wasn't Protestant, who wasn't English speaking. And again, I mean, even Benjamin Franklin, organized against Germans, for example, newly arrived, because he did not trust, that they were good enough, for the new nation. And that's something that has consistently been a pattern, in the course of the history in the US. We love to think that we are a nation of immigrants, like John F. Kennedy articulated, but the fact is we were never really nice, to newcomers. And there are multiple movies and documentaries that actually have captured, that idea very well. The second idea I want to absolutely emphasize from what Susan said is that immigration, to the extent that it became articulated as a field of public policy, was really always in the service of foreign interest, foreign policy of the US. So it's important to understand that that is precisely why immigration policy, when it comes to how does it get to be executed, is very much a centralized policy at the federal level, and not a state-by-state, type of policy that we undertake. And the other thing I also want to say is that the 1970s really marked a fundamental shift, in how we have relate to foreign nationals. For those of you who may not know, in 1970, almost 62% of foreign nationals residing in the US were actually people of European ancestry. That is how European it was in 1970, according to the US Census. But beginning in 1970, and I'm mentioning this because of some of the things that Susan covered in the chronology, precisely 1970 marked a shift where Europeans enter into a phase that continues until today, where fewer and fewer Europeans seek to settle in the US, and more people of color seek to settle in the US, particularly people from Mexico, other Latin American and Caribbean nations, and of course, Asian countries, all of whom are not white, by and large, all of whom don't come from English-speaking countries, and all of whom are not necessarily Protestant. And so I want to just emphasize that as a very important factor, which explains why from 1970 until the present, laws have become much more restricted, much more exclusionary, and much more punishment-driven in nature. I also want to emphasize, going back to the history and foreign policy, one of the arguments that a lot of people that, don't really like Mexicans, don't really like Central Americans, Asians, etc., would say is, well, these people are breaking the law and they are not coming in the right way into the country. Let me remind you that up until 1905, we didn't even use passports. People would arrive to the US with a birth certificate or whatever else they had, and they may be asked whether they were going to settle or only visit in the US, but one way or another, you essentially were allowed in. Sometimes under a lot of abuses, but you were allowed in. So there was no wrong way and right way, because basically we didn't have, the kind of restrictions that have come into place from the beginning of the previous century until the present. And the last thing I want to say in general is that US immigration policy, either taken as isolated events, such as the Alien and Sedition Acts, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, all the way until now, have always been heavily racialized. So, if you were not the right color or the right language or the right income for that matter, you were not necessarily welcome, in the US. And so I just want to emphasize those elements. One other thing I have to say is that the humanitarian protection architecture that we continue to use today is extremely obsolete. I mean, it's an architecture that was put in place in 1951 in the heart of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. And it doesn't really capture the complexity of what makes people feel forced to flee, their countries nowadays. Let me give you an example. Gang violence is not really grounds, for anybody to be considered for asylum in the US. And as a matter of general rule, you have to have an incredibly creative and persuasive lawyer to make a claim for asylum based on gang violence really stick, because literally speaking, it doesn't really fit, within the very narrow definitions that the law still has until today. And the last piece I want to say also, Susan is right. People apply for humanitarian protection either someplace abroad where the US government screened them and then allowed them to come into the US as refugees for settlement purposes in the US, whereas many others, who don't get that opportunity, come to the US and apply for asylum upon arrival in the US. But there is a big difference between the two. If you come into the US as a so-called bona fide refugee, you actually get a significant amount of support mechanisms to actually help you in the process of getting settled in the US. That does not apply to people applying for asylum in the US. Even if you get asylum in the US, you do not get any kind of governmental support. And that is something a lot of people don't understand. And that's why so many people, even, just these past 3 days, I was driving from Arizona back to Illinois, and I spent a lot of time listening to radio. And it's unbelievable, the amount of disinformation that goes on in radios by people saying, how can it make any sense for people to come and get all the benefits they get in the US that I don't get? And clearly, nobody coming through the US southern border is getting any benefits whatsoever, contrary to what people may think. So with that, let me move to what I was actually asked to comment about. And in order to have you understand better what I really want to communicate, I do want to lay out a couple of ideas that I think are important for everybody to understand the current state of affairs. First of all, let me say that not only did everything begin to change fundamentally in terms of immigration dynamics in 1970, but on a parallel track, we also began very important changes in our reality in the US and in the world, realities that did not happen overnight. Instead, they have happened very gradually. And one of the most important changes is the way wealth is distributed in the US. You know, through the mid-1970s, a lot of families in the US were able to make ends meet with one source of income in the household. From the mid-1970s until the present, that is simply not at all accessible anymore. And this is not at all anything that has to do with immigrants coming in, you know, or with immigration policy for that matter. It really has to do with the orientation that the economic policy has taken, you know, beginning in the mid-1970s until the present. And what I really want to communicate is that there are millions and millions of people in the US, many of them white Americans, who rightfully feel very fearful about the economic future. They rightfully feel anxious about the future. But it's not because of immigration. It's because of much larger economic policies that have been made that essentially have resulted in wealth being generated in ways that were never even imagined before, but they have been concentrated, you know, in ways that are very much only comparable to where we were at the very end of the 1800s and the beginning of the previous century in terms of the Great Barons, you know, era in the US. If you haven't seen Gangs of New York, the movie, it captures very well how the US was, you know, through the end of the 1800s and the beginnings of the 1900s. So it's not so unprecedented, but it's really new because it's happened very gradually and most people don't even realize. And why am I saying that this is important? Because of how easy it is, you know, for certain political interests to poison, you know, the narrative about newcomers. Let me also say something that I mentioned to Elena when we had a conversation prior to this event. You know, I've been saying this in as many places as I can. Most people love their countries. They don't really want to leave their countries. You know, even people in Haiti, which is really a very tough country to live in, Haitians love Haiti. Hondurans, the second poorest country in this hemisphere, they love Honduras. And they would rather stay in Honduras. So don't get confused by the idea that everybody wants to come to the US because it's not true. You know, it is simply not factually right to say that all Mexicans want to come to the US. Mexicans love Mexico, not only for the food, but the weather, you know, the social interactions. I mean, frankly, who wouldn't love, you know, the country they were born in? And that is true throughout history and it's true today. The only way you can really have to leave, you have no choice, is if there is war. You know, if a war, you know, interrupt life, then masses of people have to move, but not because they want to, you know, but because they are forced. And with that said, I mean, I also want to mention that the main problem that we continue to miss today in the way we continue to talk about US immigration policy is precisely the conditions in the countries from where people are coming from. You know, we completely neglect to acknowledge that if we think that things are hard in the US, they are 100 times harder, you know, in a place like Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Haiti, and many places in Mexico. And from that point of view, I mean, I think that we will continue to completely waste time and resources trying to come up with strategies to stop flows. But if we don't do anything about really addressing what's causing people to feel forced to flee, they will continue to flee and they will continue to try to come to the only place they believe is a safe haven, you know, for their troubles. I mean, and that happens to be the United States of America. I also want you to understand that narrative is also powerful. You know, when I mentioned earlier that 1970 was pivotal in the way we have come to think about immigration and immigrants, it is because it was precisely in the mid-1970s that a guy from Michigan, John Tanton, an ophthalmologist, began to craft a very well-articulated ideology that essentially paints immigrants of today, I mean by that, Mexicans, other Latin Americans, Asians, literally as garbage. You know, they have consistently painted new immigrants of the past 40, 50 years as undesirables, you know, as people that don't belong here, even though not only we need them, but they have made so many contributions, you know, to the US, and of course, contributions to their home countries, whichever that may happen to be. But I also want you to understand that today, the dominant narrative, for better or for worse, continue to be the one that I just told you. Even in the current environment, federal government-wise, I am convinced that there are a lot of good people, you know, in the Biden administration who really would want to do what is right, you know, for people seeking protection and safe haven, but they continue to be hostages to this toxic, lies-based narrative that paints today's immigrants and immigration as if they were some form of cancer. And for as long as the narrative continues to be the one still in place today, it's going to be very difficult, you know, for us to arrive to the right set of policies. I can tell you that, you know, one fundamental change also from 1970 until now is not so much that there is far more poverty in Latin America. I would actually argue that there is less poverty in Latin America today than there was in 1970. But what has fundamentally changed is access to information. You know, a peasant in Guatemala, Mexico, Haiti know that they break their back for literally $1 a day, you know, in whichever country they may be. But they also know that you can break your back in the US, but you may get $8, $10, $15 an hour. And that's something, that's kind of information people didn't have access to back in 1970. And so one of the biggest change is access to information, which is the result of the technology revolution. You know, you can go anywhere in Latin America and everybody is carrying one of these little things, you know, the so-called smartphones. And people have access to information in ways they never did before. And that has also changed dramatically the reality of migration. Let me just end, because I know I have another 3 minutes, just to say that there is no question about the fact that poverty alone does not explain, you know, why people are coming in increasing numbers, and they will continue to in increasing numbers just because the reality in their countries is so horrible. First of all, poverty indeed is getting worse. You know, just like it is the case in the US, wealth gets generated, but it gets to be concentrated, not shared, you know, among the people who are very active in producing wealth. Number two, democracy is going down the drains. You know, we are seeing more and more leaders from the left and their so-called right that are basically dictators, you know, that are basically governing in ways that are denying people basic rights, basic freedoms, including freedom of speech, you know, and others. Third, we have a problem with violence, which is connected, you know, to the decay in democracy, and is connected to poverty as well. We have new forms of violence that we didn't have when I was growing up in El Salvador as a young teenager. Gangs is something I never knew of, but they are a reality in many countries in Latin America that are making neighborhoods unsafe. And finally, I mean, you also have natural disasters that are increasingly impacting the reality of life of millions of people, which are, by the way, connected, you know, to climate change, something for which even up until today, we don't really have well-defined policies in as far as how will we protect people that are seeing their lives disrupted in ways that probably will never come back to normality, all connected, you know, to climate change. And I would feel compelled to say that just last Friday, a judge in Louisiana decided to actually force the Biden administration to keep in place something known as Title 42, a health regulation back from the 1940s that has now been converted into an anti-immigration measure. And ironically, that is something that we are likely to continue to see happening more and more, because sadly, the judicial branch of government is very much affected by who got appointed to the judge, how do you say that, judgeship positions in the US, that makes
judicial.
There you go. Because it makes it very difficult for rational, truly autonomous decisions to be made by people who are frankly very aligned with the interest and the worldview of the people who appointed them, including the judge that made this decision in Louisiana, who was appointed by President Trump. So let me stop there, and I'm sure you may have questions. And a lot of things I didn't get to say, but I don't want to go more than I already did, because I am already past my 20 minutes. Oh, that's my 20-minute mark.
Wow, thank you, thank you, thank you. What we generally do, we've commented, both of your presentations were incredible. Thank you so much. We all learned so much. Please write questions in the chat box. I can start out with a few that were asked. And then you can write them, and I think Jan Schwartz and I will sort of monitor the chat box, if that's okay with you, Jan. This is from someone from Massachusetts. They've been working with refugee resettlement for the past 6 years, and working through Jewish Family Services, and one of the families they're co-hosting an Afghan family. They're interested in issues at the southern border, and also in the immigration status of arriving Ukrainian migrants who have not been granted refugee status, which would help their resettlement here. Susan, Oscar, who wants to address?
You want to go first, Susan?
Sure. You know, I'm going to amend the PowerPoint that I sent to Beth and put in some slides of these various asylum-seeking groups, because it becomes obvious that the whiter people are getting the best possible benefits. Basically, the options that are on the table for the government to deal with people who are seeking asylum are two sets of options. One is bringing people in for refugee resettlement, and that's something that was put into the law in 1980. And every president until President Trump would set a quota per year of around 60 to 90,000 people per year would be, and then they would designate the countries. And there's where you saw the clearest articulation of US foreign policy in terms of it mediating humanitarian policies, so that the decisions on who to let into the country under the overseas refugee program had to do a lot more with foreign policy, and not necessarily the people who were suffering the most. So, for example, and I've written about this, almost no Central Americans were ever allowed into the United States as overseas refugees. But we did allow in people from countries where the wars that were going on or the repression by particular dictators seemed to be something that it would be in US foreign policy interests to say, see, this country cannot take care of its own people, or worse, is attacking and killing its own people. So the Afghans have come into the US under a couple of different kinds of status, but it's really only getting recognized officially as refugees, either because you came in through the overseas refugee program or you apply for asylum status in the United States, that will get you to be a permanent resident. Now, Congress does have the power to act. The president, the executive branch, cannot say, oh, now that we've let in the Ukrainians or the Afghans under humanitarian parole, they can all get green cards. They don't have the power to do that. What they can do is Congress can pass a law that names a particular national group. The Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966 was the first version of this, where Congress said in that law, any Cuban who makes it to the United States becomes a lawful permanent resident in a year. So Congress could, and then in the 1980s, at the end of the wars in Central America and after a successful national class action on behalf of people who had been denied asylum status, Salvadorans and Guatemalans, Congress acted again with a law that was called the Nicaraguan and Central American Relief Act, NICARA, which did grant permanent residence to people who had applied for and were denied asylum, about 400,000 people who had applied for asylum during the 1980s and been denied it. So the path for permanency is to Congress. So people who've been working previously only in agencies dealing with overseas refugees were dealing with people coming out of terrible situations, but whose landing in the United States was much softer relatively than any other people fleeing persecution or fleeing war. They would get benefits for a certain amount of time that's been cut back. There's a call for Congress to increase it. And they were on a path to citizenship that is unavailable to lots of people now. So really, I think the path there is to Congress if you're looking for a way to get permanent status for people who are seeking protection.
I would only add to what Susan just said that there are people from Ukraine that are being resettled. There is active talk in Congress to actually pass a law that would specifically provide refugee slots for people from Ukraine, and they deserve it. You know, don't get me wrong, they absolutely deserve every ounce of generosity, protection that they can be given. The problem is not whether they deserve it. The problem is how single-sided we are, you know, how very partial we are in the way we dispense, you know, protection and support to people needing protection and support. I should also mention, because I remember the question, Beth, the one that you are asking from Massachusetts. You know, I began my connection with immigration matters as soon as I arrived in the US in 1980. And back then, it was almost impossible to secure a win in asylum applications for Central Americans. As a matter of fact, throughout the 1980s, when we had horrible, bloody civil wars going on by dictatorial regimes that killed civilians left and right in places like Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, asylum claims by Salvadorans and Guatemalans never reached even 5% of approval rate, if you can believe it. And you know what I was told so many times in the 1980s? I was told, you guys do not qualify for asylum because you are economic migrants. You're not really people fleeing, you know, violence and persecution. And I found it so hard to swallow that about 3-4 years ago, a group of so-called immigration rights advocates said exactly the same about Central Americans coming in today. They said kind of jokingly, let's face it, most of those Central Americans don't qualify for asylum. And even if we give them a hearing, we should process those applications and deport them right away because they don't qualify for asylum. Very different set of people than the ones who told me the same back in the 1980s. But the common denominator is, who are we talking about? You know, we are talking about the same type of people. You know, if we were talking about Norwegians, it would be a different story, just to put it bluntly.
And the US was able to have very generous policies towards people applying for asylum from Eastern Europe all during the 80s because the communist countries wouldn't let them out. So there wasn't a lot of demand. So it's always this kind of dicey, you know, we try to push for a balance between humanitarian values and foreign policy interests. And unfortunately, usually foreign policy interests trump, and I don't like to use that as a verb anymore, but foreign policy interests trump humanitarian impulses.
Jan, let me I'll get to you. I want to read a question in the chat box. Someone says, we'd like a clarification. Permanent residency is not the same as citizenship. Is that correct?
Correct.
That's correct. Yeah. You first become a permanent resident, which is a green card, right? And if you get your permanent residence through marriage to a U.S. citizen, because Congress does believe in love, then you only have to wait 3 years to apply for citizenship. Any other way that you get it, you wait for 5 years after you get the green card to apply for naturalization. And another thing that the Trump administration was doing, much to our surprise, was they were starting a campaign of trying to denaturalize people, to say that the original basis for their green cards was that it was a fake marriage. And there's, as you know, there are a lot of interviews of married couples applying. So there's not a lot of that fraud, but they were trying to scare people as a way of cutting down the Democrats' voter base. They were trying to scare immigrants from applying for citizenship by going around and trying to denaturalize naturalized citizens.
And I appreciate Beth's question, because I personally do not use the phrase path to citizenship, because to me, it really conveys the wrong idea. You know, a lot of Americans that I've talked to, especially people who know almost nothing about immigration policy, when they hear path to citizenship, they think that what advocates are asking for is for people without any status whatsoever to become citizens. And that's not at all the way it works. You know, just as Susan explained, before you can make the option to apply for US citizenship, you have to accumulate a number of years as a legal permanent resident or green card holder, as they call it, or an immigrant visa, which is another technical way of saying the same thing. But the point ultimately is that citizenship has never been an inevitable end in the life of an immigrant in the US. As a matter of fact, today, we have what, 8, 9 million people who are legal permanent residents, immigrant visa holders, who could, if they wish, apply for US citizenship, and for a variety of reasons, aren't choosing to do so. I mean, because it is an option, it's not mandated.
Yeah, but as long as they stay permanent residents, they are vulnerable to being deported. And one of the things that 1996 law did is it greatly expanded the list of crimes for which someone can lose their permanent residence, their green card status.
Well, let me
amend there is that. No forgiveness. I mean,
let me amend that list of infractions committed, because it's not crimes. I mean, a lot of the things for which you can lose legal permanent residency are basically immigration-related infractions to the law, you know, which elevated by those people become crimes, but they're not really crimes in the sense that most of us think about crimes.
Jan?
I just want to say, I was really impressed by your presentations, and I learned so much. I was actually shocked at the degree of racism in immigration policies from the beginning, and that in our liberal Democratic presidents were just as guilty. And it makes me feel very hopeless about getting really good legislation through, given where we are as a country right now. But I felt your facts were so illuminating, and I think very few people know how literally black and white it is.
Which goes along with another question in the, thank you, Jan, in the chat box. Why was the US so against letting Jews in during World War II when they needed asylum? I mean, isn't that just another basic anti-Semitism?
We were in a race too.
Well, the State Department was full of anti-Semites, basically.
Yeah.
That's, you know, and I don't know how many of you have read that wonderful book, The Yiddish Policeman's Union, which is that counterfactual novel about Jews, about several 100,000 Jewish refugees being allowed into the United States, but they had to live on the Sitka Peninsula in Alaska. It's a great, it's a very funny novel, but it turns out that was an actual proposal that was floated in the State Department, and even that failed to pass. They wouldn't let Jews in, even if they were going to restrict them to Alaska and they wouldn't be allowed into the 48 states. So there was a huge amount of anti-Semitism.
It would have saved so many
in
lives.
the State Department. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was about to recommend the same book, Susan. So we get in sync.
Thank you. No, thank you. We will include that.
Michael Chabon's the author.
Yeah.
Oh, and you have another book. Okay. Oh, that's the, yeah. Elena put the one that we had mentioned before. That's great. We're a little bit past 8. Let me ask you read another question that was submitted. And then we'll start winding down or winding up or something. Given the large numbers of persons waiting along the Mexican border for entry into the US, how do we accommodate them in the immediate future? Acknowledging that a majority should likely be granted asylum, we do not seem to have a system in place or have systems in place to provide food, shelter, transportation, or timely evaluation of their petitions for entry.
Well, I mean, it's both the so-called migrant protection protocols remain in Mexico and the Title 42 exclusions, which now the Biden administration has gone on record as trying to get rid of both of those, and they've been stopped by injunctions from judges appointed by the last administration. Now, I hope, and Oscar probably knows a little more about this than I do, that there are 2 tracks in the Biden administration now. One, and we know a number of people have left the Biden administration because they've been frustrated, which has been going through planning to how to bring in and integrate. And we're talking about, 40, 50,000 people. How many people do we have in this country? 330 million. I remember somebody saying, that somebody was saying, well, what would, and Texas Governor Abbott in Texas came up with this scheme that he's going to bus people who enter into the US through Texas to Washington, DC. So Central Americans and Haitians and Middle Eastern, it's like Washington, DC is fine with that, but there is no mechanism that allows people to safely enter the United States. And keeping them in Mexico exposes them to incredibly dangerous conditions. One of the things that Oscar and I have both worked on for years is trying to get US immigrants' rights advocates to pay attention to what is going on in other countries. And there is some communication now between US refugee advocates and advocates for refugees in Mexico. There are a lot of NGOs in Mexico, church-supported shelters. One thing I wonder, and I'm going to let Oscar take it from here, is where is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees in Mexico, where in many other regions of the world, they set up refugee camps in situations like this and provide for shelter, food, and safety for people who are fleeing terrible situations and find themselves in insecure situations in the places they've fled to. Oscar, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Well, let me just say that something rather ironic happened about 3 years ago. The UN led a process that ended with the embracing of 2 global compacts.
Yes.
One on refugees and one on migration. And the good side of it is that there was a tacit recognition that something like refugee protection and immigration management cannot happen in isolation, by any given nation. It has to be a multilateral undertaking. I mean, that is the positive interpretation of the 2 compacts. But the not so sweet side of it is that these compacts were adopted at a moment in which, not only in the US, but globally, hate against foreign nationals has become a political and electoral weapon. That is used to basically attract voters that are dissatisfied, that are experiencing economic anxiety, that are fearful about demographic changes taking place, to basically weaponize, this issue. And as a result, the UN finds itself really very much short-handed because funding for the UN, including UNHCR, comes from European governments, the US government, Canada, and others, all of whom condition, the purpose for the support that they provide. And so what they can actually do is very limited, to be honest. And not only that, but there is something called the International Organization on Migration, which is rapidly replacing, from an operational capability, what in years past, it was more the UN Higher Commissioner on Refugees who you would see taking action. But that is not necessarily happening anymore. And again, I mean, it's pretty sad because in the end, we are talking about just making the life of people on the move a lot more fragile, a lot more vulnerable.
You have given us so much to think about. And usually we'll say, well, what can we do? And it sounds like
I can give you a couple of ideas.
Okay.
Because not everything is so gloomy.
Okay.
There are interesting stuff happening at the local level.
Okay.
Many state governments, many city governments that do have a little more loyalty to the idea that public policy should be based on good evidence, not on lies. There is more room, at many places. And I can tell you that Chicago is one place where good stuff has been done. Illinois is a state where good things have been done, but a lot more can be done, to actually be more welcoming, more inclusive of everyone based on the fact that they are human beings, not because they belong to a particular ethnic or racial group or because they happen to have or not immigration status. And I think that that's an area where everybody can help, because we can hold our local elected officials accountable to be more daring to defy the paralysis that is actually taking place at the federal level in terms of the kinds of policies that we should have already passed long ago, but we seem completely unable to do. So those are areas where you can do that. And you can also help bringing more education, like this conversation that we are having. The more places where we can have this kind of conversation, the better it is, because believe it or not, a lie that is told 1,000 times becomes reality. Yeah. And so if we don't manage to counter lies forcefully, we are inadvertently making lies become true. And I think that that's something that you can surely help us do.
Okay. I have two very quick suggestions. One is work on congressional races in contested districts. It's important to keep Democrats in Congress. Lauren Underwood is one to look at, et cetera. And then the other is, and this is kind of getting into the weeds a bit, but I think some of you have heard that there are 2 open seats on the Illinois Supreme Court, which at this point only has a 4-3 Democratic majority on it. And those 2 seats, if they are won by Republicans, are going to change the laws that we've been able to get through the Democratic legislature and with a Democratic governor that have been very helpful in expanding a notion of social, what I would call social citizenship, that all the residents of Illinois, all the residents of Chicago, all the residents of other communities that have welcoming ordinances have been able to put on the books. I'd also like to recommend that you look at the website of the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. It's ICIRR.org. They're a coalition of over 100 organizations from across the spectrum of immigrant groups, and they concentrate a lot in the legislative area. So,
okay. Susan, can we also add that if anyone here lives in the northern Illinois suburbs, that's where the 2 Supreme Court judges are. It's Lake County and Naperville, right? Or DuPage County?
Yeah, yeah.
And so anyone, that's who we really want to work hard with, that they know who the judges are when they vote.
Yeah, I want to underscore what Oscar just put in the chat and pitch for fundraising for Alianza. I'm ready, because Alianza is an organization that is constituted of organizations led by immigrants. It's based on the principle of nothing about us without us, that the voice of immigrants has to be part of the discussions of immigration policy. And they are also a model of transnational political action. Their constituent organizations work on issues here in the United States and spend a lot of time talking to their home country governments and sending delegations to work on those fundamental cause issues which create the circumstances which force people to migrate. So Alianza, and I think because they do such interesting transnational politics, they're probably the subject of constant requests from social scientists who want to research what they're doing, because it's a very cutting edge and important political development. So I'll underscore the idea that Alianza is definitely worth the attention.
Partners of ours raise, financial support. Right now, we are conducting a campaign to support a beautiful program in one of the most violent places in Honduras that is actually working with young kids and adolescents, basically teaching them about how to live peacefully and how to become educated about their own history and how to become proud of being Hondurans and become environmentally responsible, a project called Paso a Paso in a town called San Pedro Sula in Honduras. So even though we have a lot of needs, we find a way to also be supportive to partner organizations such as Paso a Paso in Honduras.
Well, we will highlight your organization in the notes, right, Beth? So that everybody will get an email with a link so we can individually donate. So we so appreciate this.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. And I did put in the chat box how to register for the next spotlight, because it's a slightly different day. Oh yeah, we will send, I always send a summary to everyone who's registered and attended, so that they will try to condense everything into one page that you have brought up. But yes, I think our enthusiasm and thinking of ways to help. It's nice knowing that we're in Illinois and things are happening here.
Right.
So we all have to vote to make sure that's true. And that's what Susan said. And it's really true because everyone's up for re-election.
Yeah. I so appreciate both of you. I mean, when I talked with you at the beginning, this was exactly what I was hoping for this conversation will be. I'm so thrilled that we have it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we are so thrilled. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Ciao.
Okay.
Bye, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.
Thank you. We'll follow up.
Sure.
Thanks.